Right, back. We're live with you tonight here on In Focus. Solidarity is preparing to approach the courts to argue against the state of disaster declaration over the energy crisis. The trade union wants the declaration announced last Thursday during the State of the Nation address to be declared unlawful. Solidarity is of the view that South Africa's energy crisis did not meet the disaster definition in terms of the relevant legislation. Well, joining us now on this, Connie Mulder, head of Solidarity Research Institute. Connie, good evening and thank you very much for your time.
Well, good evening. Nice to be here.
I hope you're listening, and maybe you could have picked up from the previous conversation what Salga is saying around what the definition is. They are believing that, as per definition, it has to be a natural disaster or a human-caused disaster that would create such disruption at the magnitude and severity that it disrupts communities, it disrupts households, it disrupts municipalities, and it disrupts other connected services. For example, not just electricity. Water is affected. Service delivery is affected. Businesses are affected. It is a disaster.
Yes, there is a second part to the Disaster Management Act, which also states that there needs to be no existing legislative instruments that can adequately handle this. And I think that's where the crux of our case comes from. This is not a new situation we're in. We've been in this for 16 years. And every single thing that President Ramaphosa announced that they want to do, every single intervention, is already possible within existing legislation, which means it can be done. There's no reason to declare a state of disaster just because you failed in supplying electricity when all the legislative instruments that you need already exist. We're talking about exemptions from the PFMA, which can be done. Electricity Regulation Act, which explicitly states that the minister can do even emergency procurement of electricity. In fact, we've done this before without a state of disaster. That can be done. A central line of command that we need to report to, per the Constitution, that's the president. So everything that needs to be done can already be done within existing legislation. Yeah. And that means we do not need this vehicle because this vehicle comes with severe risks, as we saw during COVID. We're very worried about the possibilities for abuse. We need to not forget that we thought several of those crazy regulations were completely impossible at the start of the pandemic. And 750 days later, finally, we went through warm chicken being banned. We went through sandals being banned. And there's no reason to think it won't be the same if we go down this road once again. When you give government unfettered power without any real positive or plus side, you're just inviting risks, abuse, and then obviously in South Africa always the spectre of corruption.
Interesting argument from Salga where they're saying that, well, why diagnose the problem as a disaster and then want to use other instruments when you've got the instrument that assists you to deal with a disaster?
Yes, well, we would argue, quite frankly, that incompetence is not a disaster. If the instruments that you have aren't working, then that means you need to fire people and you need to get the right people on board, and the president can do that. He has sole capability of getting rid of anyone in his cabinet. But just because people aren't doing their jobs doesn't mean you can go and declare a state of disaster, especially with load shedding. When we take into account why now, we've been in load shedding for 16 years. If you declared it in 2008, you might have some merit to say this is the reason. But we've gotten here because of a slow and steady appetite and diet of mismanagement and of just plain corruption and state capture. And quite frankly, if the instruments that we needed weren't being used outside of a state of disaster, they're not going to be used in a state of disaster. Nothing's going to change. The only thing that we're opening the door for is massive power abuse, as we've seen previously, with very little oversight, unfortunately. Whilst we're sitting in the situation that we're in, this is akin to basically somebody going for a driving test and hitting every single car on the road, and then when they stop in their driveway, they go, "Do you know what I need? I need to drive an airplane," because that's what we're looking at, and that's just not what we think is the right thing to do here. Is obviously, yes, we're not saying government should do nothing. We've been staunch advocates of government need to start making sure that the private sector and the community sector can start adding capacity to the grid, get connected, and get us out of this crisis. But all the legislative instruments that are necessary for that do not only exist outside of a state of disaster, but have existed for the past 16 years. And that's the main frustration is we could have done this. In fact, we've done several of these things before, but we could have said we need 6,000 megawatts of emergency power. Minister Mantashe can gazette that tomorrow or the day after tomorrow. He first needs to consult with NERSA to determine if there is a shortage. That should be a very short consultation in South Africa at the moment. And then say we need 6,000 megawatt of emergency power. We need it online by the end of this year or middle of next year, and then please come and tender. That can be done. There's no reason we don't need that.
That's probably, sorry, Connie, let me come in here. That would probably be part of the reason why they would want to declare a state of disaster, because of those processes of consultation that we know in this country in some instances can take all the way up to 24 months. And they're saying, well, we don't have 24 months right now. We need to be able to have a rapid response to some of these issues. So if the decision is let us get an alternative source of power, if that means we get a big ship out in the ocean and we plug in, that's what we need to be able to do.
Yes, and we are 100% able to do that already. And I think that's our point, is we can do all the things necessary to get out of load shedding without giving the government unfettered power regarding this. Because from our perspective, we're in this crisis because of central planning of electricity that has not worked for the past 16 years. And a state of disaster, per definition, creates much more central planning. And now we're going to have a small committee making all the decisions regarding electricity rather than decentralizing generation and allowing the private and the community sector to solve this problem, which we're sitting with bated breath to do. Yeah. But it's constantly the sabotage from at one point and the incompetence at the other point. State of disaster is not going to fix that. In fact, it's going to exacerbate the problem. And once we add a Minister of Electricity into the mix, you've got 3 ministers having to decide on this now. We're of the opinion, not only is it the wrong vehicle, it's going to have the exact opposite effect.
So you've raised the question of financial concerns, looting of emergency funds, which we've seen during the previous state of disaster amongst the laws that were challenged in court, and the courts have said those laws were really absurd, so for lack of a better word. But the president says, but those who are criticizing are missing the point of what I said. I said there will be a much closer watch from the Auditor General, for example, but not only that, our law enforcement agencies are ready, and they have been already working on recouping some of the money that was stolen during that time, and people have been arrested, funds have been recovered. So that should, in a sense, give you the guarantee that there will be no looting of emergency funds.
Yes, I think if you believe that there will be no looting of funds with this government's track record, then you're being recklessly naive. During the start of COVID, the president as well announced that there will be no looting. We don't want a committee after this to determine what looting happened. And then with the Auditor General involved from the very start there as well, we had massive looting. We had people plundering and price gouging to a massive extent. After that, after the COVID lesson with the state of disaster in KwaZulu-Natal, we once again had officials delivering water to themselves, plundering state funds. So this creates a doorway for looting and bypassing processes that we're almost 100% sure will once again lead to a situation where funds go missing at some point. Combine this with, in the electricity space, South Africa has a very bad track record regarding plundering. We built Medupi and Kusile for almost 300 billion rand over budget, of which a massive amount of that is just pilfered due to corruption. Eskom has massive issues every month with people stealing either parts or oil or any amount of criminality. And that means this is not a space where we need to remove oversight or to allow the same loopholes that created the previous corruption and looting. We're of the opinion the president has promised, and that's nice of him to promise that they won't steal. He might even have asked them nicely, exactly as in COVID. But the criminals in government are still there. They've not been removed, and they're going to create, once again, take advantage of the situation. Ultimately, it will be the taxpayer who will once again have to foot this bill. So this is one of the other things why we prefer just use the existing instruments. You've got them, start wielding them, and until you've actually used them, you can't declare that these don't work. If you've got ministers who do not know what they're doing, fire them. Get into a room and have an uncomfortable conversation and tell them it's time to go. You're keeping the country in the dark. But the way out of this is not to keep that minister in his position and then appoint a new one and declare a state of disaster because you do not want to get rid of somebody who's not doing their job. And that is from our perspective, it's abusing the legislative process, and it creates a very dangerous precedent going forward, where we're going to be in a disasterocracy rather than a democracy, where the government can mismanage any system into almost complete collapse over a period of more than a decade, and then simply declare a state of disaster to avoid all accountability. This would then mean, why aren't we declaring one for transport? We've got massive amounts of potholes on our roads. We do have a Ministry of Transport, but if this goes through, then that means having a ministry and having legislative instruments doesn't really matter. And as long as you can then bypass all the processes and start just doing regulations once again in a very much more authoritarian manner than previously thought. The last thing that is extremely worrying is the state of disaster persists until the disaster is over. So with COVID, we were in a state of disaster for 750 days, of which the last 100 to 200 days, realistically, the threat had passed by that point. Can you imagine with load shedding? We'll be in a state of disaster for years with government speed of enacting this, which we've seen. They've tried emergency procurement programs in the past, which just plain, it's not the regulations necessarily would speed this up. It's just the political will has not been there to actually do it, and it's still not there. This is all political theater. It's not doing the hard work of getting certain people out of the way to ensure that the private sector can start connecting to the grid and supplying electricity. And that's the worry, is we'll be in a state of disaster for 7 years, and then we'll have to declare one for transport, and after that one for water. And ultimately the way that we're governed will change to a small committee deciding everything, and then we're finding out on Sunday night once again what's going to happen this week or what not.
Mulder, I appreciate your time. Thanks for coming on, Head of Solidarity Research Institute there.